losing my baby boy in May, God blessed me and my husband with twin girls.
11 days. That's all the time that separated pure joy from absolute devastation. 11 days between welcoming new life into this world and having that world completely destroyed. On March 2nd, 2025, in East Oakland, California, a young mother's dreams were shattered in the most unthinkable way. She was just 19 years old. She had 4 children depending on her, and she had just experienced what should have been the most beautiful moment of her life: the birth of twin daughters. But sometimes, the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest. This isn't a story about a random act of violence. This isn't about a stranger lurking in the shadows. This is about betrayal at its most devastating level. This is about how domestic violence can hide behind closed doors, even during moments that should be filled with nothing but love and celebration. 11 days after bringing her twin babies home from the hospital, this young mother would never hold them again. 11 days after what should have been a new beginning, everything ended. The person responsible? Someone who should have been protecting her. Someone who should have been celebrating alongside her. Someone who shared her home, her bed, and the responsibility of caring for those newborn twins. What makes this case even more heartbreaking is the timing. New mothers are supposed to be in their most protected, most cherished state. Those first weeks with a newborn should be sacred, filled with sleepless nights, yes, but also with wonder, bonding, and hope for the future. Instead, this young woman found herself trapped in a nightmare that would cost her everything. The twins weren't even 2 weeks old when their mother's life was violently taken from them. 4 children, including 2 babies, who will never remember their mother's voice, her touch, or her love, were left behind to navigate a world without the one person who had been their entire universe. How does something like this happen? How does a home that should be a sanctuary become a place of terror? How does someone who claims to love you become the person who destroys you? These are the questions that haunted investigators when they arrived at that modest apartment on 74th Avenue. These are the questions that still haunt the community today. And these are the questions we're going to explore together in the next 30 minutes. What you're about to hear will shock you. It will anger you, and it should. Because this tragedy was preventable. The red flags were there. The history was documented. Yet somehow, a 19-year-old mother of 4 still lost her life in the most violent way possible. This story exposes the reality that domestic violence doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter how young you are, how many people love you, or how much hope you have for the future. When you're trapped with someone who has the capacity for violence, every day becomes a gamble with your life. But before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt that instinct that something wasn't right about someone's relationship? That gut feeling that made you worry about a friend or family member? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Your engagement helps us reach more people with these crucial stories. And if you believe these stories need to be told, please hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to continue bringing awareness to cases like this one. Today, we're not just telling you about a crime. We're telling you about a life that mattered. A young woman who deserved so much better. A mother whose children deserved to grow up with her love and guidance. Her name was Davonye Cummings. She was 19 years old. And her story demands to be heard, because 11 days should have been a beginning, not an ending. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, you need to know who Davonye Cummings really was. At 19, Davonye carried responsibilities that would overwhelm most adults twice her age. She was the mother of 4 children, and motherhood wasn't just her role, it was her calling. Those who knew her best described a young woman who approached parenting with a maturity and dedication that seemed to flow naturally from her very core. Davonye possessed the rare quality of finding light in the darkest situations. Even when facing financial hardships, that would crush most people's spirits, she maintained an optimism that was absolutely infectious. Friends and family members consistently spoke about her ability to lift others up, even when she was struggling herself. Her laughter wasn't just frequent, it was healing for those around her. Her dreams extended far beyond simply surviving day to day. Davonye had concrete plans to return to school. She wanted to develop new skills that would open doors not just for herself, but for her children. Education represented hope to her, a pathway out of poverty and into a future where her kids could have opportunities she never had. She spoke often about wanting to break generational cycles, about being the change her family needed. The arrival of her twin daughters represented something profound for Davonye. These weren't just two more children to care for, they symbolized possibility. She saw their births as a fresh start, a chance to build something beautiful. The weeks leading up to their arrival had been filled with planning and preparation. She had chosen their names carefully, set up their nursery with love, and talked endlessly about the adventures they would have together. Davonye's extended family knew they could count on her for support, comfort, and encouragement. Her own mother often relied on Davonye's gentle wisdom during difficult times. Her siblings looked up to her, not because she was perfect, but because she never gave up. She had this remarkable ability to see potential where others saw only problems. In her community, Davonye was known for her kindness. Neighbors recalled small acts of generosity, sharing meals when someone was struggling, watching children when parents needed help, offering a listening ear to anyone going through a hard time. She understood what it meant to need help because she had needed help herself, and that understanding made her incredibly compassionate toward others. Those closest to her knew that Davonye's nurturing nature went beyond her own children. She was the type of person who would pick up extra groceries for an elderly neighbor or spend hours helping a friend work through a problem. Her empathy wasn't performative. It was authentic and deeply felt. Davonye had plans for her career too. She wanted to work in healthcare, specifically with children. She felt drawn to helping families navigate medical challenges because she understood how overwhelming the system could be for people without resources or connections. Her own experiences as a young mother had taught her how important it was to have advocates and supporters during vulnerable times. The strength Davonye displayed daily was remarkable. Raising 4 children as a teenager required an enormous amount of organization, patience, and resilience. She managed schedules, doctor appointments, school activities, and household responsibilities with a grace that impressed everyone who witnessed it. Her children were her motivation for everything. Every sacrifice, every late night, every difficult decision was made with their well-being in mind. Friends often commented on how Davonye could make anyone feel valued and heard. She remembered details about people's lives, asked follow-up questions about their concerns, and celebrated their victories as if they were her own. This wasn't superficial politeness. It was genuine care for the human beings in her orbit. Davonye's faith played a significant role in how she approached life's challenges. She found strength in believing that her struggles had purpose, that her children were blessings, and that better days were ahead. This faith wasn't naive optimism. It was a choice she made every day to focus on hope rather than despair. The weeks following the twins' birth had been some of the happiest of Davonye's life. She delighted in every milestone, their first smiles, the way they responded to her voice, the peaceful moments when she could hold both babies at once. She documented everything, wanting to preserve these precious early memories. Davonye Cummings was building something beautiful. She was creating a legacy of love, determination, and hope that was meant to last for generations. Her story was supposed to be one of triumph over adversity, of a young woman who refused to let circumstances define her future. She deserved the chance to see her dreams fulfilled. Terrence Miles was 34 years old when this tragedy occurred, and his criminal record painted a disturbing portrait of a man who had spent years terrorizing the women in his life. Court documents revealed a pattern of violence that stretched back over a decade. Miles had multiple convictions for domestic abuse, each incident involving different victims, each case demonstrating an escalating level of aggression and control. This wasn't a man who had made one terrible mistake. This was someone who had weaponized intimidation and violence repeatedly. His first documented domestic violence conviction occurred when he was in his early 20s. The victim had been hospitalized with injuries that required medical intervention. Police reports from that incident described a level of brutality that shocked responding officers. Despite the severity of his actions, Miles received what many would consider a lenient sentence: probation and mandatory anger management classes that he completed, but clearly didn't internalize. The anger management program was the first of many court-ordered interventions that failed to change Miles' behavior. Records show he attended sessions sporadically, often arriving late or missing appointments entirely. Counselors noted his resistance to accountability and his tendency to blame his victims for provoking his violent outbursts. Miles's second domestic violence conviction came just 3 years later with a different victim. This time, the assault had occurred in front of children, adding child endangerment charges to his growing rap sheet. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court described Miles as someone who viewed violence as an acceptable method of resolving conflicts and maintaining control over intimate partners. Between his domestic violence convictions, Miles accumulated charges for theft, drug possession, and illegal firearm ownership. Each arrest revealed someone who consistently chose to operate outside the law, someone who believed rules didn't apply to him. His probation officers noted his inability to maintain steady employment and his pattern of moving frequently to avoid accountability. The illegal firearm charges were particularly concerning. Miles had been caught multiple times possessing weapons despite being legally prohibited from owning them due to his felony convictions. Each time, he claimed the weapons belonged to someone else or that he was holding them temporarily. These excuses became a pattern. Miles consistently refused to accept responsibility for his actions. Prison records showed that even while incarcerated, Miles displayed aggressive behavior towards staff and other inmates. He accumulated disciplinary infractions for fighting, threatening guards, and attempting to smuggle contraband. His behavior behind bars reflected the same lack of impulse control and disregard for authority that characterized his life outside prison walls. When Miles was released from his most recent incarceration, he was required to check in with a parole officer weekly. These meetings revealed someone who had learned to say the right things without actually changing his fundamental beliefs about women and relationships. Parole officers noted his superficial compliance with requirements while expressing private concerns about his underlying attitudes. Miles had a history of targeting vulnerable women, single mothers, women facing financial difficulties, women who were isolated from family support systems. Each relationship followed a similar trajectory: initial charm and promises of help, followed by increasing control, isolation, and eventually violence. He seemed to possess an ability to identify women who were struggling and exploit their need for support. Employment records showed Miles rarely held jobs for more than a few months. Employers cited attendance problems, conflicts with coworkers, and inappropriate behavior toward female colleagues. His inability to maintain stable work created financial stress that he often took out on his romantic partners, blaming them for his failures and using their dependence on him as a tool of control. Medical records from previous victims documented a horrifying catalog of injuries: broken bones, concussions, bruising consistent with strangulation attempts, and psychological trauma that required ongoing treatment. Each victim's story shared common elements: escalating violence, threats against their children, and Miles' ability to manipulate them into believing the abuse was their fault. The most disturbing aspect of Miles's history was his reaction when confronted with evidence of his crimes. Rather than showing remorse or accepting responsibility, he consistently portrayed himself as the victim. He claimed his partners had provoked him, that he was defending himself, or that the injuries were accidental. This pattern of denial and victim blaming persisted throughout every legal proceeding. Law enforcement agencies had created an informal network to track Miles's movements between jurisdictions. His tendency to relocate when relationships ended violently meant that officers in multiple counties were familiar with his name and methods. Despite this awareness, the legal system's fragmented approach to domestic violence cases allowed him to continue finding new victims. By March 2025, Terrence Miles represented everything wrong with how society handles repeat domestic abusers. He was a walking demonstration of failed interventions, inadequate sentences, and a system that prioritized his freedom over his victims' safety. His past was prologue to tragedy. March 2, 2025 started early in the modest apartment on 74th Avenue in East Oakland. The twin babies were just 11 days old, and the demands of caring for newborns meant sleep was scarce and tensions were running high. According to police reconstructions, the argument began around 6:30 a.m. over something seemingly trivial: household responsibilities and the stress of managing 4 children in a small space. But what started as a disagreement about daily routines quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. Neighbors in adjacent apartments reported hearing raised voices through the thin walls. The shouting grew louder and more aggressive as the morning progressed. One neighbor later told investigators she had considered calling police but hesitated, assuming it was just another domestic dispute that would blow over like so many others she had witnessed in the complex. Miles became increasingly agitated as the argument continued. The babies were crying, the older children were awake and frightened by the commotion, and the small apartment felt suffocating. According to evidence later presented in court, this combination of stressors triggered the violent rage that had characterized his previous assaults. At approximately 7:45 a.m., the verbal confrontation reached its breaking point. Miles retrieved a handgun that he had been keeping in the apartment illegally, a violation of his parole conditions and federal law due to his felony convictions. The weapon was a .38 caliber revolver that police would later trace to a theft reported 6 months earlier. The shooting occurred in the narrow hallway connecting the living room to the bedrooms. Davonye had been trying to get away from the escalating confrontation, moving toward where her children were located. Miles fired a single shot that struck her in the neck, severing critical arteries and causing massive internal bleeding. The gunshot was heard throughout the apartment complex. Multiple neighbors called 911 immediately, reporting sounds of violence and requesting emergency medical response. The older children who had witnessed the shooting were screaming and crying as their mother collapsed onto the hallway floor. Miles's immediate reaction to what he had done was telling. Rather than calling for medical help or attempting to provide aid to Davonye, he stood over her bleeding body for several minutes. Neighbors who rushed to their windows saw him pacing back and forth through the apartment, apparently in a state of panic about the consequences he would face. At 8:12 a.m., approximately 27 minutes after the shooting, Miles made a phone call that would ultimately seal his fate. He dialed his mother's number and, in a conversation that was later used as key evidence in his trial, confessed to shooting Davonye while claiming it had been accidental. The phone call was frantic and disjointed. Miles told his mother he had made a terrible mistake and that Davonye was hurt bad. He repeatedly used the word accident to describe what had happened, but his own words contradicted this narrative, as he described retrieving the gun during their argument and firing it intentionally. His mother, shocked by what she was hearing, immediately urged him to call 911 and get medical help for Davonye. She also threatened to call police herself if he didn't surrender immediately. This maternal pressure ultimately convinced Miles to contact emergency services, though by then, precious time had already been lost. When paramedics arrived at 8:34 a.m., they found Davonye unconscious and barely breathing in a pool of blood. The bullet had caused catastrophic damage to her carotid artery and spinal cord. Despite their immediate efforts to stabilize her vital signs and transport her to the nearest trauma center, the injury was too severe and the delay too long. Davonye Cummings was pronounced dead at Highland Hospital at 9:17 a.m. on March 2, 2025. She had been alive for only 32 minutes after being shot, and medical examiners later testified that even with immediate treatment, her injuries would likely have been fatal. The crime scene told a clear story. Blood spatter analysis confirmed that the shooting had occurred at close range, contradicting any claims of accidental discharge. The bullet trajectory showed that Miles had been standing directly in front of Davonye when he fired, indicating a deliberate and targeted action rather than a random or accidental shooting. Police officers arrived while paramedics were still working on Davonye. They found Miles sitting on the front steps of the apartment building, no longer in possession of the weapon, but making no attempt to flee. His demeanor was described as agitated and remorseful, but not surprised by the arrival of law enforcement. The gun was discovered hidden in a dumpster behind the apartment complex, where Miles had disposed of it during the minutes between the shooting and the arrival of emergency responders. Ballistics testing would later confirm that this weapon had fired the fatal shot, and fingerprint evidence linked it definitively to Miles. The 4 children, including the 11-day-old twins, were found traumatized and alone in the apartment. The older children had witnessed their mother's death and were in severe psychological distress. Child Protective Services was called to provide immediate care and arrange emergency placement while family members could be contacted. By 10 a.m. on March 2nd, less than 4 hours after the argument had begun, Davonye Cummings was dead. Terrence Miles was in custody, and 4 children had lost the only parent who had been caring for them. The crime was over, but the investigation was just beginning. The investigation launched immediately following Miles's phone call confession to his mother. This call became the turning point that set everything in motion, providing law enforcement with the critical lead they needed to build their case. Police worked quickly to piece together the sequence of events from that morning. The phone call itself was the most significant piece of evidence. Miles had explicitly confessed to his mother while claiming the shooting had been accidental. This admission, despite its contradictions, left little doubt about his direct involvement in Davonye's death. Law enforcement officers began uncovering Miles's extensive criminal record, which revealed his documented history of domestic violence and previous legal issues. This background information painted a broader picture of a pattern of behavior that had culminated in this tragic morning. The criminal history provided essential context that helped investigators understand this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a recurring cycle of violence. The investigation relied on multiple types of evidence to build a comprehensive case. Forensic analysis of the crime scene provided materials that aligned with the ballistic trajectory of the firearm used in the shooting. This technical evidence supported the physical facts of what had occurred in that hallway. Witness statements from neighbors who heard the argument and the gunshot contributed crucial context surrounding the timeline of events. First responders also provided testimonies about what they observed when they arrived at the scene. These eyewitness accounts helped establish the sequence of events and Miles's behavior immediately following the shooting. Law enforcement coordinated their technical forensics work with the eyewitness accounts to create a clear and comprehensive narrative of the crime. The combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and Miles' own confession created what investigators described as an overwhelming body of evidence. The immediate arrest of Miles following his confession meant there was little time for doubt among investigators about the accuracy of their evidence. His own words had provided the foundation for the case, and subsequent evidence gathering only strengthened their position. The verification of Miles's criminal history provided investigators with crucial background information that established this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, but part of a documented pattern of harmful behavior toward women. This historical context became an essential component of the prosecution's narrative. Miles was formally charged with murder, domestic violence, and illegal possession of a firearm. Each charge reflected different aspects of his criminal behavior on that March morning and his ongoing violations of the law through his possession of the weapon. The trial proceedings were characterized by the presentation of overwhelming evidence against Miles. The prosecution built their case around the pivotal phone confession, which served as the cornerstone of their argument. This confession, combined with corroborative testimonies from witnesses and first responders, created a compelling narrative of guilt. The evidence presented during trial included the forensic analysis from the crime scene, which supported the prosecution's version of events. The ballistic evidence, witness statements, and Miles's own recorded confession to his mother formed a comprehensive case that left little room for reasonable doubt. After thorough deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. The weight of evidence, particularly Miles' own confession, combined with his documented history of domestic violence, led to a clear conclusion about his guilt. Miles was found guilty on all counts brought against him. The murder charge, domestic violence charge, and illegal firearm possession charge all resulted in guilty verdicts from the jury. The sentencing phase resulted in life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for Miles. This sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and his extensive history of violent behavior toward women. The court's decision ensured that Miles would never again have the opportunity to harm another person. The legal resolution marked the beginning of a broader community response that extended far beyond the courtroom. In the days and weeks following the verdict, community members across East Oakland and beyond rallied in remembrance of Davonye. The outpouring of support demonstrated how deeply her loss had affected people who had never even met her personally. Vigils became a central way for the community to process their grief and honor Davonye's memory. These gatherings brought together neighbors, family members, friends, and strangers who felt compelled to pay their respects. The vigils weren't just moments of mourning. They became opportunities for people to share stories about Davonye's kindness and to commit to preventing similar tragedies. Candlelight marches through the East Oakland neighborhood where Davonye had lived created visible displays of solidarity and remembrance. Participants carried signs with her photo and messages about domestic violence prevention. These marches served multiple purposes: honoring her memory while also raising awareness about the ongoing crisis of domestic violence in their community. Online memorials emerged as another powerful way for people to connect over Davonye's story. Social media platforms became spaces where friends, family members, and supporters could share personal anecdotes about her character, resilience, and love for her children. These digital memorials ensured that her story reached people far beyond her immediate community. The sustained community response reflected something deeper than sympathy. It demonstrated a collective recognition that Davonye's death represented systemic failures that needed to be addressed. Her story became a catalyst for broader conversations about how communities can better protect vulnerable individuals from domestic violence. Critics of current domestic violence policies cited Davonye's case as evidence of urgent need for reform in existing frameworks. Her death highlighted gaps in the system that had allowed Miles to continue accessing victims despite his documented history of violence. These policy discussions focused on the necessity of swift risk assessments and improved coordination between different agencies. The case also sparked conversations about access to emergency shelter and comprehensive support services for survivors of domestic violence. Advocates pointed to Davonye's situation as an example of how young mothers facing abuse often lack the resources needed to safely escape dangerous relationships. The response from domestic violence prevention advocates demonstrated how individual tragedies can galvanize broader movements for change. Her story became a powerful tool for education and advocacy, helping people understand the complex factors that trap victims in abusive relationships. The lasting impact of Davonye's case extended into legislative discussions about domestic violence prevention and intervention. Policymakers began examining how existing laws and support systems had failed to protect her and what changes might prevent similar tragedies in the future. Friends and family members became advocates themselves, using their grief as motivation to help others facing similar situations. They organized fundraisers for domestic violence prevention programs and volunteered with organizations providing support to survivors. The case established a model for how communities can respond to domestic violence tragedies, not just with sympathy, but with sustained action aimed at preventing future losses. The integration of legal justice with community activism created a comprehensive response that honored Davonye's memory while working toward systemic change. The memorials and advocacy efforts ensured that Davonye's story continued to serve an important purpose, even after the legal proceedings concluded. Her life became a symbol of the potential that is lost when domestic violence is allowed to continue unchecked. In commemorating her life, the community was urged to confront difficult truths about domestic violence and to adopt policies and practices that better protect vulnerable individuals. The sustained attention to her case created momentum for conversations that might otherwise have been avoided or delayed. Davonye Cummings became more than a victim. She became a catalyst for change, a symbol of lost potential, and a reminder that every individual life has value worth protecting. Her legacy challenged society to do better for future generations of young mothers facing similar dangers.